Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits and I have updates on my various Finish It February projects. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me in a direct message on Ravelry from, I believe the name is pronounced Sigridor. It's giving the heads up on a really interesting YouTube channel that is produced by a Scottish sheep farmer who is named Cami Wilson. There were two videos in particular that Sigridor thought were of interest, and this kind of stuff is always fascinating to me. I love seeing anything that sheep farmers do with the sheep as they're being shorn, and then how the wool is processed later. And so these two videos that Cami Wilson produced were really interesting. He went on a trip down to Bradford, England to visit the wool board. And that's where they sort and grade through all of the bales of wool. And then he also went on a trip to the plant that scours wool. So those, and they're pretty lengthy videos. The one on scouring is about 20 minutes, and the one that's at the wool board is about 40 minutes. So they're an interesting way to just see what happens to the wool as it is shorn, after it's shorn from the sheep, and then is sent off to be processed, and what happens to it in between when it's on the sheep and when it's in your hands. So I will leave links to Cami Wilson's YouTube channel, as well as the two specific videos that Sigridor gave me the heads up on. I always love looking and seeing artwork that depicts knitters. This is a woman walking along a beach, and she's getting herself a little bit more yarn from the ball before she works the next row or two. The painting is by Winslow Homer, and it was done in 1884. He's a North American painter born in Boston. So I was led to this painting on Instagram. Somebody tagged me in a post from Interweavecrafts. On that post, they featured this painting, and then they also mentioned that if you've been reading Interweave Knits for a long time, you might remember that we used to have a knitting and fine art series published in the magazine written by Fronia E. Wisman. And you can find the full article about this work of art in Interweave Knits Fall 2004, and Interweave subscribers can read the article on interweave.com. So if you're a member of the Interweave website, you would be able to read that article, and I will leave it down below. But if you're not a member, you can't, but I will leave a link to where you can get a closer look at the painting down below. There's a little bit of information about the painter and where it's been exhibited, etc. For the past couple of weeks, I've had a tidbit regarding those Olympic bouquets that are being given to athletes who reach the podium. And at first I said they were knitted, and I wondered who the people were who were actually creating these bouquets. And then I realized these were actually crocheted, and several people who sent me links to articles about the mostly senior citizens and crafting clubs who were creating these bouquets. The articles sometimes said crochet, sometimes said knit in the same article, sometimes even said weaving. And there were some video interviews with these people. I wondered if perhaps in Mandarin the same word was used for both knitting and crochet. And then I also wondered about other languages if they use the same word for both of those things. So I heard from quite a few of you, and I thought this was just so interesting to me. So I'm going to show you the comments on the screen. So we've got one comment from Preslava Novak, who said in Bulgarian we use the same verb for knitting crochet, and if you want to be clear, you have to add with 2 needles or with 1 needle. So I thought that was really interesting. So it's the number of tools you use is what differentiates which craft it is. Next from Ella, who said in Korean, knitting and crochet are both called, and then she puts the word there. To differentiate them, we say the name of the tool in front of that word. And so then she shows what the words are. So there's one that's like needle, and then the craft, and then hook craft. So that was really interesting. Love 933 said, Japanese here, we also use the same word. And then she put in a character and said that that is the Chinese character we use in Japan for both knit and crochet. And we differentiate by saying stick needle and hook needle. Weaving has a different word. So I'm curious about why you would use a Chinese character in Japanese. That's interesting to me, something I know nothing about. We also heard from Nadia Rogo. In Russian, we also use the same word for crochet and knitting. And so again, this is a language where you differentiate by saying with needles or with a hook, if we want to differentiate. Or if you would say that your hobby is vianzanie, people would sometimes ask whether it is with needles or hook or both. So then we heard from John Avocado, who says, yes, there's a generic word, but then you can also add additional words to help differentiate between the two. So there might be a word that just means yarn craft is basically what that generic term would be, but you can differentiate between the different crafts by indicating tools. So then we also heard from Asaf in Israel and said in Hebrew is also a language where the same word is used for both knitting and crochet. Oh, I did get one post in my Ravelry group in the discussion thread for that video, and it was from Trevster, who introduced an interesting difference, which is that in Spanish, knitting and weaving use the same word, but crochet is distinct. And he said the word tejer means both to knit and to weave. Tejedor or tejedora is both a knitter and a weaver, and tejido can mean both any fabric generally or a piece of knitting. So there are other words which denote knitting more specifically, and but none of the above words are used for crochet, which is ganchillo. So I found that fascinating, that sometimes when a language uses the same word for both knitting and crocheting, that the differentiation is by number of tools, and sometimes it's by type of tool. So thank you all for leaving those comments. I really did appreciate it. I am behind in reading all of the posts in the chat thread, and there's just tons of posts already in the no chat thread where people are posting pictures of their finished items. So I'm going to be spending this weekend getting caught up on that because you guys are really enthusiastic about it. I'm even getting tagged in Instagram posts from people who are doing Finish It February, so that's really cool. So I personally, for Finish It February, am working on 2 knitting projects and then 1 fix-it project. I often fix something or enhance something in some way during Finish It February. These things like, oh, I wish this sweater had a belt, or I wish, or, you know, this elbow is wearing through. I really ought to fix that, and I never do it. And so I just like kind of look forward to February knowing that I will be like ready and motivated to do things in February. So I have 2 knitting projects. One of them is one of my vintage sweater projects that I was knitting last year. It's a 1960s vintage sweater. I was really unhappy with how the sleeves turned out when I knit them, and I had a few different gauge issues that I talked about, I think, last week. And so I needed to re-knit these sleeves. So last week I was sort of in progress on the sleeve, and I made some sort of offhand remark about, oh, you know, I even though I don't like 3/4 length sleeves, I might end up knitting these 3/4 length. And I got about, I think, like 5 comments from people saying, no, if you don't like 3/4 length, you should make them full length, even if you have to put the sweater in a timeout again before you're ready to work on it. And I appreciate the encouragement. I didn't give you any context for why I would be completely okay with 3/4 length sleeves if it came to that. So before I started Finish It February, I wanted to kind of see how much work was actually going to be involved in knitting these 2 sleeves and in knitting the knee sock. So I always do a spreadsheet before I start a project so I know how many stitches there are, and that tells me right away, am I going to need a break from this project at some point. I had my stitch counts for the sweater, so I knew how many stitches the original sleeves had. And I also had knit the first sock of the pair of these knee socks. And so I knew how many stitches were in the first sock. So I could see the total number of stitches I was planning to knit in February, and I could tell whether or not that was doable. I wasn't going to try to push myself. I was just like knowing my average number of stitches I typically knit in a week on projects, because I also do other knitting that doesn't have to do with projects, it has to do with swatching for technique videos or just experimenting and figuring something out. But when it comes to project knitting, I know about what I knit on average in a week. And I also know that if I'm making a video, I probably won't be knitting very much that day. So my plan when I started finish of February was I'd give myself 10 days to knit the first sleeve. Then I would take a break from the 60 sweater and I would knit the knee sock. I'd give myself 8 days to knit the knee sock. And then I would give myself 10 days to knit the second sock, and that would fill up the 28 days. And in there somewhere, I would also sew on some elbow patches onto a sweater that had worn through, and I knew that wouldn't take more than a few hours, and I would do that at some point. So when I was talking last week, I was looking at seeing whether or not, if it looked like I wasn't going to be able to finish the sleeve in those 10 days. That was really as much time as I wanted to commit to those sleeves. It doesn't really matter whether or not I like 3/4 length sleeves, because I never started the sweater with the idea that, oh, I can't wait to add this to my wardrobe. This sweater is part of the long-term project that I've been working on for 3 years to knit a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. So I'm looking at the evolution of the hand knit sweater in terms of construction, in terms of techniques, materials and tools, how patterns were presented to knitters. So I'm looking at every sweater in that overall context. So when I am choosing a particular pattern that I'm going to knit from a decade, I'm looking at something that's emblematic of that decade, something that has an interesting construction. So something that is different from what I've done before and is interesting and that I will learn from. So I am looking to learn things from the overall project and from the individual projects. So that is the thing that's most important to me, is trying out different construction methods and seeing how those fit into the overall evolution and learning something from it. And the last thing that I really care about is whether or not I'm going to end up wearing it. I mean, I would love to end up wearing it. That would be nice to have something that ends up in my wardrobe, but there have been a few that I really do like wearing, but there are a few that there's like no way I'm ever going to wear those, but they were so interesting to knit that I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity. The 1960s sweater, what it has going for it is that it's 60s, that it came from a vintage sweater kit, and it has coordinating hand woven wool fabric to sew a skirt from that came with it as well. Like, that was what was exciting to me about this. There were some construction elements that were really interesting, but it's fingering weight. I don't have a whole lot of use for fingering weight sweaters because of the climate I live in, the fact that I don't run very warm. Like, I'm not a warm person in terms of, I need heavier sweaters. I sit most of the day. I live in Minnesota, so I don't get much use out of fingering weight sweaters. I tend to prefer heavier sweaters. But the mid-century is a period of time when there were a lot of fine gauge sweaters. My 1940s sweater is also fingering weight. I don't anticipate wearing that one very often either. Even though I think it's a cool sweater, I just don't see that I'll be able to wear it very often because it's fingering weight. And that one also has shorter sleeves, these interesting bell sleeves, not something that I would normally choose to wear myself, but something that I think is interesting and is an interesting part of the 1940s. So that is what's important to me, not so much whether I'll end up wearing it. So when I was trying to decide about, when I was thinking that I might end up knitting these 3/4 length, it was because I was thinking about how much of this sleeve I could stand to knit, not so much whether or not I was going to wear it. The other consideration was that I was very short on yarn the first time I knit these sleeves, and making the gauge changes, I wasn't sure how that was going to affect the amount of yarn available either. So it could have been I was going to end up with a weird length sleeve anyway. I just didn't know. As it turned out, I was able to complete the sleeve yesterday, so a day earlier than I had anticipated, and so I was fine knitting it the full length, and I even had a little bit of yarn left over from the original sleeve when I did finish this. So it all worked out. So I just thought to give you that context about the decisions that I make about these sweaters and the process I'm going through. It just tends to be quite different from the decisions that most people are going to make if they're going to actually spend all the time knitting a sweater. They're going to pick something that they're absolutely going to want to wear. And that just isn't the case for me in terms of this particular long-term project. So originally the sleeve was supposed to be cast on down at this edge and then knit up with increases up to the underarm, and then the bind offs were done, and then there's shaping right here, and then the cap is shaped. But because I was so worried about the amount of yarn I had originally, what I did was I cast on using a Judy's Magic cast on as a provisional cast on across here, and then I knit the cap as it was originally written, so that all of the decrease lines would match up with the body decrease. So all the shaping would be done exactly as it was originally written and would fit in that way. And then I came back to that provisional cast on and I knit the sleeve down this way, doing decreases. So this allowed me to determine whether or not I was going to have enough yarn or not to knit the whole sleeve. So I could knit it as long as was possible when I knit the sleeve originally. And so I did the same thing when I knit it the second time. So at the bottom of the sleeve, I used a type of sewn bind off called a half hitch bind off. It's also known as an outline stitch bind off or a stem stitch bind off. I used the method that is in Principles of Knitting rather than using the method that Elizabeth Zimmerman explains in her books, because I think the half hitch version is actually extremely simple. But this type of bind off creates the same look as a long tail cast on. And that was what I had used to start the body of the sweater, and so I thought it was a good choice for ending the bottom of the cuffs. For this knee sock, I'm not using a pattern. I never use a pattern for a stockinette sock. I always choose the toe that I want to use, and then I choose the heel that I want to use, and I make modifications to whatever the standard instructions are for the toe or the heel in order to fit the specific foot that it's intended to fit. And since this is intended to fit mine, I need to accommodate a high arch and long heel diagonal. So I used a regular wedge toe right here. So on each half of the round, you knit a stitch and then you do an increase. And so you're starting and ending with a knit stitch and doing an increase, and then you do a plain round. So that's like a standard type of sock toe. And then I used what is called a plain heel, which is like, you could think of it as an insta-thought heel. So instead of an afterthought heel or a forethought heel, you creating this heel as you get to it, but it's knit in the round toward the heel, just like any peasant heel, afterthought heel, forethought heel, whatever. But you do this by putting these stitches on hold in order to knit the heel, and then you do a provisional cast on to create these stitches here, and then you can knit the whole thing in the round and doing your decreases. So I really like being able to knit the heel in the round. In order to accommodate my large heel diagonal, I cast on more stitches right here than I have for here or here in order to create a larger circumference, which means I also need to knit more decrease rounds when that increases the length of the heel. So you can see that there's like a little gusset right here. I have a series of videos on the plain heel that I'll link to above and below. So, so then what I was doing for this leg is that I have 10% negative ease for the ankle, which is pretty common. If you're knitting a standard length sock that ends right before the calf muscle bulge, you just maintain that stitch count all the way up and you end up with more negative ease around the top of the sock. And you kind of need that because you need to defy gravity. So you need it to be even tighter around the top of the sock than it is down at the ankle. But with a knee sock, you don't need this much negative ease that you have in a regular sock. You don't need that much in this portion of the sock. What you do need to know though is how much negative ease you need around the calf. So that was the experimenting that I was doing. I think I came up with somewhere around 20 to 25% negative ease around the calf. So what I was doing in the leg is when I got to the point where I had 20% or 25% negative ease because my leg was getting bigger, that's when I started doing increases in order to maintain that 20 to 25% negative ease all the way up to the largest part of the calf. And then sometimes people will do decreases as the calf gets smaller. It wouldn't have been very many stitches for me. I decided just to keep it straight. So I still had some negative ease right here and I wanted to see what the ribbing would do. Originally finished the sock, I just knit until I was halfway, until I knit half of the yarn that was in the ball. And I ended up with something that was long enough to get up to my knee. But when I wore it around, the sock would slide down about an inch. So it would stay up, but it wouldn't stay up right under my knee. It would just kind of slide down a little bit. I decided to break into the second half of the ball of yarn and just continue knitting in order to double the length of the ribbing. And by doubling the length of the ribbing, I could then fold it over. And that meant that this part of the ribbing had to stretch more than the internal part. So I effectively increased the amount of negative ease around the top of the sock because of the 2 layers of ribbing. Once I figured out that this would all work, I decided, well, I would like to knit a second sock, but I didn't have enough yarn to knit the second sock. So I found another ball of that colorway and ordered it, and then I could start it. But then I had the problem of finding the starting point in the colorway to start the toe, because these large purple sections, I had started the toe somewhere in the middle of this large purple section. And what I had done when I had started this first sock is, because I wanted to preserve as much yarn as I could, I wanted to make that half of the ball go as far as I could. I just started the toe wherever the beginning of the ball was, and I didn't care where I was in the colorway. My thinking was that if I could create a full knee sock out of half of the yarn, I could create the second sock and the stripes wouldn't match up, but I'd get a full pair of socks out of the 150 gram ball of 6-ply yarn. But I ended up using more than 50%, which meant when I get my second ball, I could either, again, just start it wherever it was and the stripes wouldn't match, or I had enough yarn that I could make it match if I wanted to. But then the trick was figuring out where I needed to be within this big span of purple in order to end up with a second sock that matched it. And I was able to do that pretty well. It may or may not be exactly right, but it's going to be close enough that it's probably not going to be visibly noticeable. And here is how I did that. I have a spreadsheet for this sock. So I know exactly how many stitches were on the needle when this switched to pink. I can see that I have, in this row of pink right here, I can see my make one increase. And this is the very last make one increase that I had. So I know exactly how many stitches I knit in order to create this toe. And it was something like 436 stitches, somewhere around there. I also know that my gauge was 6.5 stitches per inch. So I can say 436 stitches divided by 6.5 stitches per inch. That tells me how many inches wide these stitches would be if they were all in one row, all lined up, how wide in inches that span of stitches would be. Then I know that in order to create a stitch that's a particular width, I need about 3 times that much yarn to create the actual stitch. And that uses a geometry where the diameter of a circle times pi, which is 3.14, you know, what, etc. The diameter times pi tells you what the circumference is. So you can estimate the amount of yarn needed to make a row of knitting based on how wide that row of knitting is. You can say you just need 3 times that much yarn. So I know that 436 stitches is a certain number of inches wide. I need 3 times that much in order to knit those stitches. And so then I can just divide that total by the number of inches in a yard. So like 36 inches in a yard, and that tells me I needed 5.5 yards in order to knit this. Again, this is an estimate. This is completely an estimate. I expected to be off a little bit. So what I was able to do was wind off until I found this particular point in the colorway, and then measure back 5.5 yards in order to find the starting point to cast on for the second toe. And I just happened to get lucky with my estimates, and it worked out well enough that these are going to match pretty well. The last thing I'm working on for Finish It February is to put a patch. So this is a spot that was wearing very thin. I reinforced it with a fingering weight sock yarn that has some nylon in it. I just did some duplicate stitch. You can kind of see it. It matches pretty well, but I wanted to protect it even further. So years ago, I bought these cowhide suede patches, and so my intent was I would sew them on here. So I laid the sleeve out, and I was looking at how I was going to lay this out. And my first instinct was, oh, I would put the center of the patch, line that up with the center. Well, that's not going to work. It's going to go into this cable that's running down the sleeve. And if I move it over here, I was just trying to figure out, how am I going to do this? How am I going to center this? This patch is pretty big. And so I'll try the sweater on to try to get it exactly centered and figured out. I wasn't sure if I needed to actually move this over and line it up over that seam or not. I just wasn't sure. So I also knew that I was going to need to use a type of stitch called blanket stitch. And I've done blanket stitch before, but I just needed a refresher, and I thought I'm just going to see if there's some tutorials online that kind of might give some tips for how to do this kind of elbow patch. And I found one, and she was using ultra suede or fake suede fabric. She just bought some fabric and she cut her own elbow patches out and was sewing it on. And I thought, okay, that's fine. I'm just going to watch how she's doing the sewing. And she was using blanket stitch. But she also mentioned, if you use real suede for your elbow patches, that the next time you need to wash the sweater, you're going to have to take it to a dry cleaner that can clean leather. And I hadn't considered that at all. I absolutely don't want to do that. I want to be able to just hand wash my sweater. And so I took a look online to see if I could find just pre-made elbow patches from fake suede, and most of them were iron-on. And I finally found a seller on eBay. They even have the little holes punched in them and everything. And they're slightly smaller, so I think they actually will fit a little better on this sweater because they're a little bit smaller. And this is a pretty close-fitting sleeve. So I think I'll be able to get this on, and it'll just fit a little better in the space that I have. And it's also going to be easier to pin this on to just make sure that I have it in the right place before I sew it. So this is something that I will be doing probably in the next week or so, probably before I knit the second sleeve of my 1960s sweater, as I will attach these. But I'm really happy I found these just because I think it's going to be a little easier to get these to fit on the space that I have here on my sleeve. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.